In this presentation, we're going to focus on compassion. And in the first part of this presentation, we're going to discuss the inner critic. This is an internal voice that sends critical messages and prevents ourselves from being self-compassionate. And then we move on to the topic of self-compassion. So what is self-compassion and what is the link with mindfulness here? And finally, we will address the importance of cultivating self-compassion. Why should we become more self-compassionate? And what are the effects of being more self-compassionate? So let's start with the first part, the inner critic. All right, before we continue, I think it's nice to start with a small exercise. So what I would like you to do is to imagine yourself in a situation in which you were disappointed in yourself. For instance, because you made a mistake, you failed to reach an important goal, or because you messed up something, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Just a situation in which you were disappointed in yourself. And once you got this situation in mind, I want to ask you a few questions about this situation. What were the words you spoke to yourself back then? What kinds of words were you using? What was the tone of the inner voice? How would you describe the way you talk to yourself? And finally, how did it make you feel? How did you feel because of the way you were talking to yourself? Well, if you're like most people that do this exercise, you will find that the words you used are, well, most of all, accusatory, making all kinds of accusations, reproachful, and also attacking. It's that we're very aware of the fact that we did something wrong. We're attacking ourselves, and this is reflected by the words we use. If we analyze the tone of voice, we often see that it's hard, angry, and disappointed. And the feelings we experience as a result of this voice are most likely to be feelings of failure, shame, guilt, inferiority, and fear. So these are very typical feelings that emerge as a result of, the way we speak to ourselves when we mess up. The internal critic that we experience is often reflected by sentences like, "What is wrong with me? How could I let this happen? Why me? There's nothing I can do right. If I continue like this, I will inevitably fail. I'm a fool." And the examples that I've shown here are all personal examples. These are all things that play in my mind when I do something wrong, or when I'm failing, or whatever. These are like typical examples of self-critical thoughts that I have. But these are all in my mind, in my head. Nobody else hears them. But we also have the same process in a more social setting. So when other people around us, we may do the very same thing, saying the critical thoughts out loud. And then it's something like, for instance, like, "I look like a fat cow in this dress." This is what a woman might say when she's, shopping with her friends. "I'm hopelessly inept with computers," or "I have the worst sense of direction of anyone I know." "I think the worst cook on this planet." Or this one, "I wonder how many times I've made this mistake before." When we look at these statements, that we say out loud, it is as if we're saying, I'm going to beat you to the punch and criticize myself before you can. I recognize how flawed and imperfect I am, so you don't have to cut me down and tell me what I already know. So it's as if we're saying, like, okay, I'm not perfect. I know, I'm aware of it. So far we talked about, a voice that we use to criticize ourselves. And this voice, when it's inside ourselves, when it's talking to ourselves, is called the inner critic. So it's an internal voice that commands and sends negative messages. And when we analyze the type of messages, research shows that there are like 3 types of messages that the inner critic uses. The first one is an imperative "you should." you should do better, you should try harder, you're not good enough, you should work harder. The second one is related to disapproval. The second message is about disapproving thoughts, feelings, and behavior. For instance, like you shouldn't feel this way, it's weak. You shouldn't behave this way. People may think that you're this or that. And the final one is about predictions. So negative predictions about the future. If you continue like this, you will end up like a failure. Or if you continue like this, nobody will love you anymore, whatever it is. Those are the most typical categories that we find are there in the inner critic. So what are the consequences of having such a strong negative internal voice? Well, first of all, let's focus on the intrapersonal consequences. And these are the consequences for the individual himself. And what we find in research is that a strong inner critic is, highly related to the etiology and preservation of different types of psychopathology. So stated differently, many types of serious problems that people have are characterized by a very strong negative inner voice, such as problems like depression, social anxiety, drug addiction, but also eating disorders. All these, and these are just a few examples, all these problems are characterized by, a very strong negative inner voice, a strong inner critic. Personally, I've done quite some research with people with eating disorders, and here you see that the inner critic is mostly related to, things related to appearance, food. I don't look good, I'm fat, I'm ugly. Compared to other people, I'm not worthy because I look this way. Or good food is perceived as, like high caloric food is bad, low caloric food is good. So if you eat high caloric food, you're a failure. So many of the thoughts that people experience and the tone of voice and the words that the inner critic uses is also dependent on the problems that people experience, of course. People in the field of depression may have different kinds of inner criticism compared to people in the field of eating disorders. All right, but these are all interpersonal consequences. Let's focus on consequences that go beyond the individual. So what we see in research is that people who have a very high level of self-criticism, in general, they have less friends and are less satisfied with social support. They also use more negative communication after a stressful event. And they report lower levels of trust and share a low amount of personal information. And these are just a few examples, of consequences of the inner critic. In any case, I think it's valuable to remember that the inner critic has serious consequences for well-being. So when we focus on the possible cause, how come we all have, or most of us have a very strong negative voice inside our head? Well, a possible cause has to do with, being raised by our parents. We find in research that children with parents who are highly critical and are focused on control and performance will also be very self-critical when they grow up and become adults. And what you often see also in research is that the self-critical voice in our head often mimics the tone of voice or even like the sound of the voice of one of the parents. So there are like strong clues that suggest that part of the self-criticism that we experience is learned through behavior and through modeling of our parents and other, caregivers or relevant people in our social environment when we grow up. So this is a possible cause. Now let's focus on self-compassion. So far we discussed, we could say a very low level of self-compassion. The voice that is very critical and negative is often not very compassionate. So let's focus first on what compassion is. Well, compassion is defined as the sensitivity to the experience of suffering, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. So this means that in order to be compassionate, we have to open our eyes for the suffering of other people. And at the same time, we feel a strong desire or need to alleviate that suffering. We wish the best for other people, and we wish that they don't suffer. What compassion is not, because when we mention the word compassion, to many people, they have a lot of misconceptions. Some people believe compassion is about suffering. When somebody else suffers, you suffer as well. It's like co-suffering in this way. But co-suffering would mean that two people are suffering, and this can never be a good thing. It's sad enough that one person is suffering, obviously. And co-suffering, compassion is also not, victimizing somebody. It's not like, okay, this person is suffering, he is having a hard time, and therefore he is a victim because he's struggling with life. Because if we adopt this kind of attitude, compassion becomes something like, okay, this person is weak and he needs to be helped. So you immediately create some kind of distance between you and the other person. The other person is not, victimized. So what is compassion? Well, compassion involves, first of all, acknowledgement of pain. In order to be compassionate, we have to be open to other people's pain and be aware of it. And also, of course, to be able to relate to pain, we have to understand our own pain. And I think this is the good news about suffering, is that it allows you to connect to other people's suffering as well. If we would have never suffered in life, it would mean that we could never know and feel what other people would feel. The very fact that we often have suffered from a similar or maybe even the same pain causes us to connect to other people because we feel sorry for them. So it's a matter of empathy, being able to reflect on the behavior and the thoughts of the other people and consider their point of view. It's also acceptance. Compassion is accepting the person who suffers rather than wanting him to change or doing things different. It's about accepting this person as he is with his problem. And of course, there is a strong wish that the suffering may decrease. This is, I think, one of the most characteristic things of compassion. There is a desire, a wish that the suffering may decrease. What is self-compassion then? Well, basically, self-compassion is compassion directed towards the self. So previously, we discussed what compassion is. Self-compassion is the very same thing, but then directed towards the self. So a definition of self-compassion could be, as I said, compassion directed inward, relating to ourselves as the object of care and concern when faced with the experience of suffering. So in the same way we wish that other people are free from pain and suffering, and we wish them the best, in the same way we do this to ourselves. We have the same wish, and we take care in the same way we would take care of somebody else who is suffering. And as easy as this may sound, from my own experience, I know that many people, find it extremely difficult, including myself. So what self-compassion is not is something I think we should address before we continue, expanding on self-compassion, because there are a lot of misconceptions here. Well, first of all, self-compassion has nothing to do with self-pity. Self-pity means that we, end up in a story like, oh my God, this is happening to me, poor me, and we feel like everybody else is doing a better job, and we feel isolated from all the rest, and we end up in some kind of emotional tunnel vision, becoming identified with a victim role. Self-compassion has nothing to do with this, as we will see later. Self-compassion is, I think, and a beautiful way to demonstrate this is when we hurt ourselves, when we do something that causes pain, emotional pain, physical pain, whatever it is, we take care of ourselves. So when we, to use an analogy here, when we, hit with a hammer and on our hand, on the finger, and we experience a lot of pain, what we normally do here is we just, we take care of the wound. And in the same way as if we would take care of our physical wounds, self-compassion can be compared to taking care of emotional wounds. Just, rather than, what we often do, just hitting once more because we criticize ourselves, hitting once more on the painful spot with the hammer, we take care of it. We let go of the hammer, and our first priority is to take care of the damaged hand. And I think this is also what self-criticism often is. We first experience the pain of messing up, of not succeeding, and on top of that, we make it even worse by stressing the fact how miserable we are and having a very strong inner criticism. And the inner critic can be compared like a hammer who is constantly, after having pain, just hitting once more, hitting once more, hitting once more on the pain that we already have. So self-compassion is taking care of, the wound, taking care of yourself in a way. What could be a self-compassionate voice then? Self-compassionate voice could be something like, I tried my best. I'm just like everybody else, just a human being. I never signed a contract to be perfect. I learned something here. Next time we do it differently, and so on. So if you compare these sentences to the ones we associated with the inner critic, I think it becomes very obvious that there is a huge difference in tone of voice and character, in intention here. So self-compassion, as it also becomes evident from these examples here, is characterized by an intention to take care of oneself. So self-compassion has three key components. The first one is self-kindness, as opposed to self-judgment. Being kind to yourself rather than judging yourself for being imperfect. The second one is called common humanity, which means that rather than feeling isolated and feeling as if it was only you that this could happen to, common humanity is the realization that all human beings now and then suffer, all human beings make mistakes. It's part of the human condition. And finally, there is, here we go, mindfulness. And mindfulness is opposed to over-identification with problems. So rather than, becoming absorbed by the problems that you have and so on, it's also about stepping back and, of course, becoming aware, in the first case, of the very fact that you're suffering. Mindfulness is awareness. We cannot cultivate self-compassion if we're unaware of our own suffering. So mindfulness is also a very important ingredient here. So let's analyze these in more detail. Let's start with kindness. So as opposed to kindness, we said there is this hard, critical, negative self voice, which is very judgmental, attacking the self, even if you have even if you experience a high level of pain, you continue no matter what to fix the problem. And often there is also a very strong focus on the outside world to solve the problem. I need to make this up. I need to correct my mistakes and so on. So it's going on despite of the internal pain that is experienced. What kindness means that we take care of ourselves. Rather than attacking the self, we accept the self for suffering and for failing. The fact that we fail doesn't mean that we, become less as a human being. And rather than continuing, despite of the pain, no matter what, we stop. And the first and primary focus becomes to heal the self. So rather than continuing, we stop and we take care of the self. So this is a kind attitude that is actually cultivated in self-compassion. The second one, common humanity. What often happens if we fail and make mistakes is that we experience a strong sense of isolation. We feel as if this only could happen to us. And sometimes our mind tells us all of the rest, all the other people are having a normal life, a normal happy life, and you're here, being miserable. So we feel isolated from the rest. What common humanity means is connection. It's rather than feeling as if this could only happen to you, it is becoming aware and experiencing that everybody feels and makes mistakes now and then. And rather than feeling isolated from all the people that are successful or having a normal life, you feel connected to other people through the suffering here. So it's being aware of that everybody suffers and everybody makes mistakes. And through this awareness, we experience connection because we sense on a deeper level we are all human beings. It's part of the human condition. So this is what we refer to as common humanity. And finally, we have, of course, mindfulness. Mindfulness is all about awareness. And when we mess up, what we often do is we're not even aware of it. And we don't take any pause, and we end up in all kinds of stories, all kinds of self-created stories about what this means and why we did so, and how stupid we are that we could do so, and so on. And we end up in a lot of judgment and punishment. And mindfulness means, of course, stopping in the first place, taking a step back. Maybe you remember from the second session, taking a pause and starting to observe thoughts rather than believing them and making them worse. Just what's going on in my mind? What kind of negative thoughts do I have? And also becoming aware of the tendency of the mind to judge and to punish. Nothing more. It's just to observe. And by observing, of course, we decrease the impact of the negative voice. So these are the 3 key ingredients. Now, in this final chapter, I want to focus on the importance of self-compassion. So why should we focus on cultivating self-compassion? Well, first of all, research shows that there are a lot of personal benefits, what we call interpersonal effects that apply to the individual himself. So we see that people who score higher on self-compassion also report lower levels of anxiety and depression. They also show less rumination and thought suppression, and have better insight in feelings and coping with negative feelings compared to people who score low on self-compassion. And these are just a few results. Over the years, there have been a lot of studies on self-compassion, and the goal is here just to show you that research has been devoting attention to self-compassion and has shown that there are a lot of positive benefits here. What are interpersonal effects? So effects that extend beyond the individual. We see that people who are more self-compassionate, they're more emotionally connected to other people. They're more accepting and also autonomy supporting. They're more satisfied with their relationships, and they have less need to project fault onto partners via angry accusations. So these are, again, just a few examples, but they show that, interestingly, becoming more kind towards oneself, which we could say is like as a process that is predominantly taking place inside ourselves, has consequences outside ourselves. Some people, when they hear the word self-compassion, they say, I need a very strong critical voice, I fear that when I start to cultivate self-compassion, I will not be motivated anymore to address my personal weaknesses, and I become lazy, basically. Well, research has shown that self-compassion has nothing to do with becoming lazy or not becoming motivated. In fact, research has shown that people who are more self-compassionate show greater personal initiative to make needed changes in one's life. So in other words, when people become more self-compassionate, they're actually more likely to correct mistakes and make changes that are needed. And I think it also makes sense. I think I'm not sure about you, but when I personally experience a high level of self-criticism, I'm not feeling very, very energized or something. I feel like I'm being hurt, and because I'm being hurt, I feel small. I don't feel good about myself, and in this state, I'm not really motivated or confident about myself. What we also see is that people who are more self-compassionate, they show more internal reasons for motivation, not social approval. So this means that rather than focusing on other people and having a strong outside focus, they're more intrinsically focused, more autonomous in their motivation. And also we find greater intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. Again, the same principle. People become more motivated in a way that is actually signaling personal agency. So these research findings show that self-compassion is probably a very good way to actually deal with problems rather than to avoid them. If we analyze why this might be, we can again compare what's going on where we're highly self-critical, which is often an emotion-based self-attack, which is characterized by the wish to punish and judge ourselves, The dominant emotions are anger and frustration, and the focus on the complete self. I'm useless, I always screw up. There is like a very negative image of the complete self. And there's a strong focus on not messing up again, a strong focus on prevention, and there's a strong fear of not being good again in the future. So this is very typical for an emotion-based self-attack. If we compare this to compassionate self-correction, so when we want to improve ourselves based on self-compassionate view towards ourselves, we see a completely different picture, because rather than a wish to punish and judge ourselves, the wish here is to grow as a human being, the wish to improve. The dominant emotion here is not anger, but it's support. It's the realization that we need support, and that we can grow from our mistakes. And whereas an emotion-based self-attack, which is often very black and white, I messed up, I'm a complete failure. In the compassionate self-correction, we zoom in and see that we did something wrong, a specific thing, rather than ourselves as human beings are wrong. So we focus on a specific aspect of our behavior or the self that we want to improve. And here the focus is very much on growth and hope for success, rather than prevention of failure and the fear of failure. So you see here that compassionate self-correction can still, compassion is not about not correcting the self anymore. It is a very powerful way, I believe, to improve oneself, but it's based on a kind relationship with the self, rather than a negative self-attacking relationship with the self. Thank you for your attention. This was the presentation.